Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming on what is a rather gloomy spring evening, but I hope the courtyard intrigues of tonight will make it worthwhile. We're very pleased to have Kathy Curnow with us. She's the Associate Professor of Art History at Cleveland State University. She came there by a rather circuitous route, she told me earlier today. She was a student at Indiana University, where she got her PhD in art history and African studies, and then moved to Nigeria the same month as graduating. She taught art history at Nigerian Television Authority's TV College for 5 years, where she headed the General Studies Department and devised the college's curriculum, which apparently included a quiz show starlet and many umbrellas, flasks and ties, as well as producing a cultural children's puppet show. So she's something of an unusual academic by any standards. She's won a number of grants and 2 Fulbrights. She's worked for many years in Benin, as well as in other parts of West Africa. And as a result, she's published a great deal on this theme and has been involved in exhibitions, not least one that's opened in Vienna and will shortly be at the Chicago Art Institute. For us, she's been the associate research professor at the Penn, teaching African art history here over the summer. And she, most of all, is responsible for the upcoming exhibition, which opens on the 8th of November in conjunction with the Halper and Rogarth seminar, which is entitled ER, Splendor and Tension in Benin's Palace Theatre. Courtly intrigue seemed to attract her, and that's her theme of tonight's subject, and a very pertinent subject for this building. Kathy.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, it's true. Courtly intrigues do involve me quite a bit. Tonight, we are going to have a look at one particular aspect of the upcoming exhibition. The exhibition, and I should first say welcome or abohien to this informal talk. Our exhibition is dealing with splendor and tension in the palace, and you'll see plenty of that tonight, and become a little bit more acquainted with certain aspects of the tension. Many of the people associated with this emotion are the chiefs, and we're going to concentrate on them. They've historically dominated much of Benin's society and are still vital players in it, in the arenas of both the palace and the greater region. First of all, just to set the stage, I'm sure some of you are familiar with Benin and others aren't. Benin is a kingdom that's within Nigeria. Nigeria is Africa. Benin now, or formerly I should say, occupying an area that was much of southwestern Nigeria, today considerably smaller. Benin City is its capital. This is the main heartland of the Edo people who occupy Benin. And there are other groups of people, the northern Edo, some of the Igbo, the Yoruba, Ichikiri, Yoruba, who were part of the kingdom in one way or another in the past. The chiefs are under the king, or the Oba, that is Omanoba Erediowa there on the left, and the objects that we're going to have in our show are known to us because of the 1897 invasion of Benin by the British. And thousands of artworks came out during that period. You can see a couple of members of the expedition there, surrounded by some of the 1,000 or so plaques that have now been spread worldwide, as well as a number of bronze and ivory figures, jewelry items, etc. Amongst these items are objects that are used by chiefs exclusively. There are plenty that are used by the Oba and the rest of the royal family, but tonight we're just going to look at this aspect. Some of the plaques show chiefs, like the one on the upper left. These are all items from our collection here that will be in our exhibition. Others were worn by chiefs, such as that bronze cuff on the upper right, or the hip pendant there at the lower right. Others were carried, like the bird you see at the lower left, in ceremonies by chiefs. And some were personal items, like that wooden box at the bottom. That actually is meant to hold kola nuts, and the chiefs present them to visitors to their homes as an act of hospitality, and have a number of varied forms that these take. This is a mudfish, a very popular motif in Benin. It's a kind of, it's a sort of a variation of a catfish that can move on both land and water, and is seen as an apt reminder of people that can move from the supernatural world to the world of the living. And this is one of those boundaries that chiefs, among other individuals, straddle by virtue of the skills that they need to acquire to both get and keep their positions. In both past and present, the palace has been a real center of activities for Benin. There at the left, a 16th century plaque that shows a number of courtiers in front of one of the shrine areas. You can see the shingled roof and the tower with the snake coming down. We have the only snake head in North America, and it'll be on display in our show. Today, the palace has no snakes, but it has plenty of pennants and other decorative touches, as you can see. It was destroyed in 1897 and rebuilt 17 years later. It's had several additions since then, but it is still primarily an earthen building. Many of the chiefs and inhabitants of Benin, in fact, have suggested that a new building be built for the Oba, for the king. But he himself wants this kept as it is because he feels a tie with the past in it. It is air conditioned, however, despite the earthen areas. I think that when one is considering a place like Benin today, and we're jumping through the centuries like this, you might wonder what it really means to be a chief. This is a word that's used in different aspects throughout Africa. Sometimes a chief is a ruler, depending on which part of Africa we're talking about. At other times, he is a titled person who has no governmental capability and never did. And in a case like Benin, he is really at the service and assistance of the king. So the chiefs have varied duties, as we'll see, but they work for the king. They are his representatives, they are his workers, they are his counselors, depending on which kind of title they hold. But why men strive for titles and what motivations they have that link both the past and the present becomes a kind of an interesting question. Because as we'll see, Benin has different kinds of chiefs. Some birth orders stick you with a chieftaincy. That is, if you have a certain type of title, you will be a chief if you are the oldest son, no matter what. But actually, those titles are in the minority. Most titles are awarded. So for instance, I met a chief when I first went to Benin, and at that time I think he was just about 23, but he had already been a chief for 11 years because when his father died and he was 12, he was installed immediately. So he had already had quite a bit of experience. That's not, however, the norm. So we have past and present here. On the right, one of the current chiefs with a hairstyle that is exclusive to them, as long as they still have hair. And on the left, on one of our tusks, a chief in very high status attire indeed. We'll talk a little bit about that later. I want to, just as an example, give you a little bit of insight into the motivations of a particular person. Because being a chief, in certain ways, is a pain in the neck. You are at the beck and call of the monarch. You may have other business, other jobs, but if he wants you to do something, you have to drop all that. It can be a very expensive proposition, as we'll see, both to keep up appearances and also to fulfill your duties as a chief. So in this modern world, why would someone want to do that? You know, it is a big draw on the time. And there are a lot of children and wives who would prefer that the men in their life not become chiefs, because it drastically changes everybody's life. A woman who might have, for instance, freely associated with everyone, as soon as her husband becomes a chief, she no longer is able to shake the hand of a man who's not a relative. she cannot sit on a sofa that an unrelated man sits on. There are all kinds of things to be remembered and rules that can't be broken that do not make for an easy transition. This is a photograph of the father of a chief I know very well. This man in the photograph's name is Ehator Obasigye Ogegben, and he went by really a nickname which was Sea Never Dry. Sea Never Dry means your pocket is never empty. A wealthy man, in short. He lived out in one of the, well, at that time was an outlying village of Benin. It's now what you would call a suburb. In fact, it's usually referred to as an executive suburb because a lot of wealthy people live in it. And in this photograph, you can see him seated with his coral beads and his eben. That's a ceremonial sword that all chiefs own. But he wasn't a chief. This man had the misfortune of having had a father who died young. His grandfather was the Ogegben of this village. Ogegben is a title for one of the princes that was sent out to rule outlying villages. This was a practice with the kings. Presumably, although it didn't always work this way, the eldest son always took a title. The eldest son of a king always was the crown prince. The eldest son of a chief, if he was a hereditary chief, would be the next chief. The eldest son of any man was the heir. But although that worked in theory, it wasn't always practical. If a man died when his eldest son was a child, if that child didn't have enough support, his younger brother could nab the position. And this particular ruler of an outlying area, his eldest son was Obasigye. He had a younger brother. Obasigye died when Obasigye died, and Ehator was too young to inherit the title, so his uncle took it. And that uncle's son inherited, and that man's son inherited. Meanwhile, Ehator had no title, but remembered what should have been his, and in childhood stories passed this information on to his son, Oduyafor. So Oduyafor's first cousin is a provincial ruler. Oduyafor grew up knowing that should have been his position. This is what motivated him to become a chief. He was determined to outstrip his cousin. Since that title had been taken away from his father, and his grandfather didn't receive it either, he was determined that life would see that his branch of the family had a lot to offer. And he became a chief. This is Chief Edi Oduyafor Ehator Obasigye, the Obasigye of Benin Kingdom. And as the Obasigye, he is one of the high-ranking chiefs. And he has been one now, more than 20 years, I think. And it has certainly made a big difference to him and to his family. He was a wealthy man before he took the title, but taking that title made a difference. Having chief before your name in Benin still is a significant moniker. All chiefs are not equal, however. Just because you're a chief does not mean you're wealthy. And it doesn't mean that you are particularly well-known or, well, you are considered to be more important than a commoner, but there are vast differences, as you can see in the interior of these two chiefs' homes. These are photographs taken in the same year. On the left, we have a chief who has actually an altar with objects that many collectors would find to be to prove his wealth to the extreme. On the right, one of the most, one of the wealthiest men in Benin. The chiefs are divided into a couple of different categories, and these categories prescribe what they do, but also something of the influence that they have. There are over 300 chiefs working for the Oba today. And Benin is not a huge polity. I mean, there are just over 1 million Edo in the core Benin kingdom, not counting the northern Edo and some of the associated groups. Let's just take a quick look at the differences between or amongst these groups. The Uzama, there are only 7. They are the descendants of a group of men who assisted the first dynasty before the 14th century. They have hereditary titles, they have their own neighborhoods in the city, and some of them have markets named after them or special privileges that their ancestors inherited. Privileges of jurisdiction, of dress, of owning objects that no one but the Oba can own normally. They've had also a history of major conflicts with kings in the past. And this gets into some of our tensions because these are not only remembered by historians and ordinary people for that matter, but they are reenacted in some of the palace ceremonies. So major conflicts in the 16th century, in the 18th century, and their power was eroded at each point of conflict. So today, their role is mostly ceremonial. They're vital to certain celebrations at the palace because they are reenacting their historic role where they have to beg the Oba for forgiveness, for instance. And they have high status, certainly, but their role in day-to-day activities is limited. The Agaivo Nore are the highest ranking group of chiefs. There are about 28 titles now. And I should say that the Oba is free at any time to invent new titles or to abandon old ones. So the numbers of titles become fluid. These men are usually self-made men and wealthy. And in the past, they were the generals. They had to have a lot of influence because there was no standing army. Each general was expected to raise his own army, so they had to be popular and have a lot of young men who flocked to them and were interested in their leadership. And of course, they were often interested in their leadership because of a series of favors that had been done for them. They act as counselors to the Oba today. They often, because of their position in business or other parts of the political and social worlds of Nigeria, know people. They're close to governors. They might be close to the head of state. They can advise the Oba on ways to interact with the rest of the country or outside the country. The royal rivals to the king, because there has been a history of struggles between certain chiefs and the Oba, usually come from this group because of the very influence that they acquire. And most of their titles are non-hereditary. Occasionally an Oba has gifted one of these chiefs by allowing his title to be inherited, but it's fairly rare. The Agaivo Nogbe are the third group of chiefs. There are about 289 of them. They form the bulk of this group, and they're involved mostly with palace, daily, and ritual life. A lot of them are drawn from the guilds because Benin has a system whereby there are hereditary groups that produce objects for the Oba or do particular things for the Oba, royal guilds. And a lot of them have chiefs within their ranks, sometimes more than one, depending on the size of the guild. More of the hereditary titles are in this group than in either of the others. And even within this very large group, there are subdivisions. It's interesting just how much the Obas, past and present, have kept information, vital information, about how things work, ritually and otherwise, out of the hands of everyone. Bits and pieces belong to each group. In fact, the three groups, Iwebo, Iwegwe, and Ibiwe, are only allowed access to certain parts of the palace. So an Ibiwe member can never wander into an Iwebo room, for instance. They all have their own quarters and passages and so forth, and their own secrets. Iwebo is the most important and senior group. They're in charge of the Oba's regalia, his coral beads, his dress, his ivories, etc. They're in charge of the music that's performed at festivals. The artists and craftsmen come from this group. And formerly, they were the group in charge of foreign trade, which made them a wealthier group indeed. Iwegwe is a group that is primarily concerned with the Oba's personal well-being. They do the divination for him. They are involved with ritual purity, also physical and spiritual healing. The sword bearers, the bodyguards, and the ancestral records are cared for by this group. Ibiwe is concerned with the harem. Today the Oba has 4 wives, but in the past, if we talk about the 18th century, for instance, or previous, 400 would be more the norm, but today 4. But the Ibiwe group still is concerned with the care of the harem and with the royal children. At least 63 of the 334 titles are hereditary, but if you didn't inherit your title, as most chiefs did not, there are a lot of stages involved with becoming a chief. First of all, even getting an offer involves either the Oba deciding you deserve an honor, or more likely, you intimate that you wouldn't mind having one, which means you already have to have connections within the palace and let that word get out, that should he so honor you, you wouldn't throw it over your shoulder. The chiefs, once the Oba has decided, yes, indeed, he's going to do it, he sends a number of chiefs to your house at night, and he decides that you are worthy of the honor, and if you are smart, you will accept it. You wait a few days, and then you officially pay him a courtesy call to thank him for this gift. And you're dressed very simply at this point. You can see these 2 men in white. Only one is getting a title. The other is accompanying him. And this is done without drumming, without much fanfare. It's just a simple acceptance. You then have to pay fees to your class of chiefs, whether you're an Agaivo Nore, Agaivo Nogbe, etc., and they share out that money. That is a very important part of getting the title. And if you stick at this point, there are certain things you'll be ineligible to do until such time as you've paid. About 3 months later, at least 3 months later, the Oba will call you to come to the palace to confirm your title. This is called come to the gates of glory. That's what is said to these would-be chiefs. These are men that you see here are men that are already chiefs, just present for this ceremony. This is when you find out both what your specific title is and what your entitlements are. Because when I say all chiefs are not equal, there are sumptuary laws in Benin, and only certain people are allowed to own and use certain objects or have particular privileges. For instance, the Oba may decide to grant you the privilege of calling your wife a queen and your children princes and princesses. That's a very high honor, and most chiefs would not receive that. But at this ceremony, they would find that out. You can send word to the Oba what privileges you would like to have, but this is when you find out whether indeed he will give them to you or not. On the left is a plaque not from our collection, but showing a chief from a 16th century work holding a ceremonial sword, and you can see he has a feather coming from the left-hand side of a beaded headband that he wears. He has a very high beaded collar that's covering his chin, and he has a strand of beads running from one shoulder to another. These, as well as beads at his ankles and brass armlets at his wrist. Every chief will get the sword. That is a symbol that is shared by them and by the Oba. It's one of the royal emblems. But the other elements are not shared by everyone. That high collar, for instance, you can see at the upper right a chief wearing the high collar as well as the headband and feather. But the lower photo shows a half collar, a much shorter one. So everyone can see at a glance whether you're entitled to either one, because not all chiefs get to wear the collar at all. So are you a half collar chief or a full collar chief? Certain types of headgear are specifically granted at this time. That's a hat at the upper left. It is a very old one. Its color has faded a little bit. It's been kept by, this is a hereditary chief. In fact, the chief who inherited it 12 years old, that's his hat. It belonged to his father and grandfather, and he doesn't wear it to ceremonies, but he's kept it. At the lower right, a headband with a long strand of beads hanging from it. Again, varied levels get them. That long strand of beads, this is a sort of an interesting piece of regalia. Like a lot of items in Benin, it has its own history. In the 15th century, a young prince was to take the throne, but he had been very miserly growing up with a slave that had been his companion since he was a toddler. And anytime he had food or leftovers or anything, he wouldn't let his slave eat them. Even the peelings of yam, which are normally thrown out, he caught him eating them one day and had him beaten severely. So at the time of his installation as king, he was processing through town, and the slave took a poisoned arrow and shot him in the forehead and killed him. But he didn't die immediately, because the poison acted slowly. Of course, the slave was executed. But the prince, in order to cover things up, because of course this was a very bad omen, the chiefs immediately bandaged his head and then put beads around it and to cover the bandage. After his death, it became an item of regalia, and that long strand represents the dripping blood from the wound. Some of the costumes that are still worn today actually have origins that go back 500 years. 16th century plaque from the British Museum shows chiefs, as you can see, in a kind of scalloped attire. It would have been red. This is a special cloth called odion that was imported by the Portuguese who first contacted Benin in the late 15th century. Their high hats with brass ornaments also still worn, and you can see them with that eben. That sword is the symbol par excellence for the chiefs. And we have the highest ranking chiefs only are allowed to wear that kind of attire. Here at the right, another set of chiefs, two who are the only ones in the kingdom who are entitled to wear a red hat made out of that same cloth with brass ornaments that has this high protrusion. At the left is one of our objects, probably 18th century, possibly earlier. It originally showed all three figures with just such a protrusion on their headgear. The middle figure is the Oba. The flanking chiefs are the ancestors of these two particular ones, Chief Osa and Oswan, who were the advisors of Oba Esigie in the 16th century, and who steered him carefully through a civil war with his half-brother. They stand together in a triad position, which is one of the major motifs in Benin art, two chiefs supporting the Oba, and the chiefs, of course, represent not only themselves, but the whole of the Edo people who are behind the Oba. He can't move without their assistance. In fact, Barbara Blackman spoke of a quote regarding this, about how the Oba, in past times, asked his supporters who would help him carry the weight of the crown. And indeed, when we see the Oba dressed for the most important ceremonies in a whole gown of coral beads, a crown of coral beads, coral beaded shoes, and so forth, it's attire that weighs probably between 30 and 50 pounds, so some assistance is welcome. However, you'll see this pose is not only one, this pose of support is not only one of the Oba and his chiefs. The chiefs themselves, when they are out in ceremonial procession, also have that kind of support, because they imitate the Oba as much as they dare. Now, not every chief would do that. If it's a low-ranking chief, I've never seen a low-ranking chief be supported by others. It has to be someone who has risen high enough that that would not be looked upon as an odd kind of arrangement. At the middle there, you can see an ivory, probably a 19th century ivory, a waist pendant, that shows that same kind of arrangement, and there the protrusions that prove that these are the same chiefs are present. They haven't broken off. Another privilege that people gain at this time has to do with architecture. This is an old photo from 1891, one of the earliest photos ever taken in Benin, taken before the invasion, as a matter of fact, by Cyril Punch, who was a trader, a British trader in the area. And this is a chief and his home. You can see that there are grooves in the building. That is a privilege that the Oba has. The palace is grooved with those horizontal markings, and certain chiefs are allowed to have that as well. I see when I was writing my PowerPoint, I forgot to take my note out for this one. I say shrines to Mom because of Mother's Day. I was going to mention that, but as it turned out, I didn't put the picture in. The Oba has shrines to his mother. Very few chiefs are permitted to have them, but a few that he's given that privilege to, or his ancestors have shrines to their mothers. And whereas the Oba's mother has the privilege of bronze roosters, such as we have in our gallery, a chief's mother only gets a wooden hen. But still, at least she has that, and not all of his brethren are allowed to honor their mothers in that way. But those grooves on the buildings today manifest themselves sometimes through actual grooving and sometimes through paint. These are three contemporary buildings that have them, and you can see some of them get picked out by white, others don't. The lower two are houses. The upper one is actually a store, because the Oba happens to own the shopping plaza. Oh, sorry, not the Oba. The chief happens to own the shopping plaza and has marked it so that people realize that it's owned by chief. People take these privileges very, very seriously. There's a group within the palace whose job is to enforce the sumptuary laws. And at the left you can see the gate and I don't know what you would call that design. It's, oh goodness, it's not cement. It's some kind of a special compound that's done in a decorative way on the sort of the inside of the flooring of the compound, if you like. In both cases, what you're seeing is the crossing of the eben sword with the second royal ceremonial sword, the Ada, and the crossing of those two is a royal privilege. The Oba owns both of them, and he allows every chief to have an eben, but only a few to have the Ada. When the chief that owns this building put those emblems originally on his gate, he did not yet have a chieftaincy title, but he was the son of a chief, so he had the privilege of using them. However, some of his neighbors didn't think he did, so they went to the palace and complained, and the enforcers came to investigate and so forth, and there would have been a fine and a quick removal had he not had the right. On the right you can see one of our ceremonial swords, the eben at top, and on the bottom a detail of our Ada that has beautiful chasing designs on it. Okay, so you're awarded your title, you've been given your privileges. Next there is a gap, and that gap varies in time. And it's not the Oba this time that decides how long it will be, it is you, because the next stage, the final ceremony that you will go through in becoming a chief is expensive. So you have to wait till you can afford it. And some chiefs still haven't afforded it and have received their titles decades ago. During this break between the entitlements and the final thanksgiving and confirmation of your title, you go through a period of what's called testing. Now, it's not called testing. That's not a formal name. Let me give you a practical example. A chief I knew had told me this story, but when he had first become a chief, he was traveling back and forth from Benin to Lagos, which, depending on what condition the roads are in and whether it's the rainy season or not, can be 3 hours or 5 hours. And it's a dangerous road, not only because of potholes, but because of armed robbers. And his car, in fact, was stopped by armed robbers. His driver ran away, and he was shot in the leg. He confronted them, trying to get the gun, and was shot in the leg, and then the robbers ran as well. Lucky for him, his driver went to get help, and they took him to Lagos to the hospital, and he had to be in a cast, I think, for 6 months. And he had expected that he would have visitors from Benin, his fellow chiefs, sympathizing and so forth, and indeed they came. They didn't come very quickly. His friends who were not chiefs were there rather rapidly. So when they came, they didn't seem particularly sympathetic, and after all, he was a new chief. He was a little bit offended by this and a bit surprised. And he expressed this to them, and one of them said, "You're supposed to be a chief." And he said, "Well, yes." He said, "You have to know how to resist things like this." What he meant was, as a chief, he had to acquire more knowledge of the supernatural and of what's called medicine. And this is our example of medicine, 19th century medicine here. You have to learn how to stave off the attacks of others, which could come in the form of a car accident, could come in the form of an illness, could come in some other manner that are meant to try and test you. And the idea that he absorbed from this was not necessarily that other chiefs had caused this to happen, although he didn't rule that out, but really that if you are to be of use to the Oba, you had better know how to protect yourself in order to better serve him. And even though that particular incident may not have been caused by other chiefs, during this break between your awarding of title and its confirmation, other chiefs will test you. And Benin is very proud of its reputation for supernatural mastery and medicine. And in fact, it has a very strong one. I remember when I first lived in Nigeria, I lived in the Middle Belt, the north, and when people heard I was interested in going to Benin, the people there were horrified. They said, "Benin? That's a medicine place, don't go there." So, but people in Benin sort of like that, at least when it serves a purpose. It's a useful kind of a reputation to have because people are more likely to do what you want them to do. And therefore, this idea of testing comes up over and over again, even to the present. And whether, in fact, any of it is effective or not, other chiefs are, and ordinary people as well, are gleeful storytellers about just how much people can be tested. I had gone to a ceremony one year and came back the next year, one of the simpler ceremonies, the actual awarding of privileges, and came back the next year to hand photos out. And I was gleefully told, "Oh, that one's dead, that one's dead." And I said, "What?" They said, testing now. So not everybody survives this period now, whether it's not always due to advanced age, because you can, although if it's not a hereditary post, you're unlikely to become a chief before your 40s, but you may get the title much later. So if you have survived the testing, you go to your Thanksgiving ceremony. And this is one which is full of pomp and circumstance. It involves an entourage, it involves a lot of display, and eventually, after the more celebratory aspects within the palace are finished, you go on a pilgrimage around town to show everybody in Benin what happens. Now, the procession aspect will vary in size according to how many supporters you have, how big your family is, and how well they like you, and how much you're willing to do things for them. If you give your family new cloths to show family solidarity, they will appreciate that and they'll turn out for you. If you are a chief with a lot of clubs under your patronage, there are all kinds of women's clubs, there's the Rotary Club, there are many different clubs, and usually chiefs have to become great joiners and patrons of clubs in order to garner support, because having an entourage is critical if you're going to vie for the position of being a known chief rather than just a simple one who goes to the palace every day. Most of the chiefs I'm talking about are in that Agaivo Nore group, that group of counselors. And this was a medium-level chief proceeding to the palace under the umbrella that you see there, and I will not burst into song, even though every time I hear that song I think of Benin, if you are a Rihanna under my umbrella fan. And here we have the chief and his family and entourage moving through town towards the palace, some of them to great excitement, as you see. He has to hire drummers, and he'll often flesh out the group of supporters he has with some hired supporters too. Upon arrival at the palace, his wives will line up. Ceremonially, they've been anointed with chalk, which is a sign of happiness and good fortune. They are wearing their hair in a style that the queens wear every day. But today, wives of chiefs, although in past centuries, wives of chiefs wore their hair this way, if they were given the privilege. This is another one of those privileges. Today, you'll never see them wear it except on a ceremonial occasion. And in some cases, it's their own hair with supplemental padding. In other cases, for convenience, it's a wig. They'll wear it for this ceremony and for a few other ceremonies that the chief might have in his home. There are usually today 4 women that are dressed like this with coral in their hair and coral beads. Not all chiefs are polygamous, although a number are. But it's as if that too is part of what makes you a known man. You wouldn't want to go, if you only had one wife, you would not want to show up with only one woman at this ceremony. It doesn't look grand enough. So you will look for sisters or cousins that are, you know, particularly your pretty sisters and cousins, and they'll dress up for the occasion and round out the numbers. When that same chief I was talking about that became a chief when he was 12, in his early 20s, he was at the university going to law school, and he has the only palace in Benin that predates the British invasion. Everything else was burnt and destroyed, but his wasn't. And so he decided that it might be interesting and useful to make a video showing the palace. And I happened to be in town that time, and he invited me to come and see it. And he wasn't married, but he wanted to sort of stock it in a theatrical way. So he had invited 4 of his classmates to act as his wives for purposes of the video. And it was really very funny because, as you can see, these women are covering their mouths with handkerchiefs. This is something that well brought up people used to do in public. You really aren't supposed to, if you are a dignified person, laugh or show anger, for that matter, in public. The Oba almost always shields his mouth, as do his wives and as do certain chiefs and their wives. So this is a perfunctory gesture, but the girls that he had brought in from school were not from chiefly families, so they just found the whole thing very amusing, and they were giggling, much to his distress. He was very unhappy with them that day, although it turned out all right in the end, a good video. While your wives are lined up, as are your supporters, you come out and dance before the Oba and assembled group of chiefs. And this shows that you have successfully completed your period of testing and you are now a full-fledged chief. You then go on a pilgrimage through 14 stations in town, shrines that mark often places where there were actually homes of chiefs who supported the Oba, or other types of places, old shrines connected with deities as well. That whole idea of entourage is one we'll see a lot of in the plaques. One of these, the one on the left, is our plaque, the other from the Peabody at Harvard that we hope to borrow. They both show an important chief in the middle, surrounded by an entourage. Hieratic scale is at work, so the chief himself is not only centrally placed, but he's much larger than the other figures. And in fact, rank on the one on the left is very much determined by size. There are some very small figures down here, and above, musicians, tiny musicians, medium-sized accessory holders, and much larger warriors flanking this central figure. And this concept of entourage is even one that's operative on the Oba's altars, where statues of courtiers, not just statues of the Oba himself, but of various courtiers, were placed on ancestral altars to provide him with an image of entourage throughout the ages. Chiefs have a lot of duties and obligations. One of the things they have to do is to drag themselves regularly to receptions at the palace. And I don't mean entertaining receptions where there's food or drink. Just everyone that comes into Benin pays courtesy calls on the Oba. And they are lengthy, and a lot of oration is involved, and gift giving. And not every chief does this on a daily basis, but it is a regular practice, and you should show up just as in meetings anywhere. This is the throne room. As you can see, the Oba there on the throne, his Ada bearer standing next to him, and several chiefs seated. You also have to entertain lavishly at home. people, if you are one of the bigger chiefs, and this is again one of the things that divides chiefs, is this matter of money, frankly, and whether you're willing to spend it. If visitors come to your house, you don't just offer them a Coke, although that might be amongst the things offered. You better have other things at your disposal, and people gossip about it. They will talk about, oh, when I went to Chief so-and-so's, he gave me, well, there are many, many things, cognac or this, that, or the other thing. Or he didn't even offer me. So people do talk about these things. Cola nuts, this is when you would again share cola nuts with your visitors as an aspect of hospitality. You are expected, if you are one of the higher ranking chiefs, the Oba may call on you to go with him for governmental meetings to the capital, to represent him at various domestic events. He gets invited to weddings and openings of companies and so forth. The Oba really doesn't venture publicly out of the palace very often, but he'll send a representative. Or to international occasions. When the Vienna show opened up, the Oba sent 2 of his brothers and about 3 or 4 chiefs along with them for the opening of the show. You're also expected to participate in palace ceremonies and in general to support the monarchy. This is one of the main ceremonies practiced in December, AJERO.G, where the chiefs come out and dance for the Oba by throwing those ceremonial swords in the air. Although actually they throw them more on the way to the palace, because if you drop them in the palace, it used to be your life was forfeit. Today you have to pay a hefty fine and sort of slink away in disgrace for a long period. So most of the time the chiefs who do this frequently will throw them with their supporters outside, and when they come in they'll just sort of twirl it in their hand, because that's a big risk, especially if people are using medicine against you. You see, this is one of those venues where it comes up. The chiefs who are at the top are often grand rivals with one another. What we're seeing here again is a palace ceremony. That bamboo pole is for those who are going to dance with the Oba. Unless you've paid your dues to your fellow chiefs, you can't pass under that pole and dance. So this is a sort of a reproach to those who haven't yet made up for the fees. Once you are there, you will find ways, and apparently this has always happened, to show other men at the top just where you are relative to one another. And part of this is done through display. Coral beads are very, very important in Benin, as are red stone beads, chalcedony. The red stone beads are darker, they're older. The coral beads were one of the main exports the Portuguese, or the main imports for the Edo people, from the Portuguese. And from the beginning, their novelty as a red bead, but a brighter red bead and a more expensive one because it was imported, that novelty factor was important in display, and Edo men vied for them. They were the privilege of the Oba to give out, and they are still very, very expensive. The bracelet you see on the right is made out of ivory. For most of Benin's history, ivory was the privilege of the Oba alone. But there was a point in the 17th and 18th century where there was so much of it available, and some of the Obas were not so strong, that certain of the big chiefs had ivory bracelets. And so we're seeing one of those here. This particular one is showing the figure from an earlier era. It's an 18th century bracelet, but it shows a 16th century Portuguese figure, and he's actually holding bunches of beads in his hand. Again, the novelty factor and the expense factor for both the ivory bracelet and the beads. That continued through history. On the left is a British lantern, a 19th century lantern that one of the chiefs inherited from his great-great-great-grandfather. And at the time, it would have been a very expensive and unusual item and would have been put on display so everyone else knew that he had it and you didn't. The Oba himself, in the late 19th century, imported galvanized metal so that he could roof the palace with metal rather than the wooden shingles and thatch it had enjoyed before. He was, of course, the very first person in Benin to have this. On the right is the first two-story building in Benin from the early 1900s, owned by a chief. So always this group at the top uses their wealth to acquire novel forms of expression as well as expensive ones. And this is still true today. The textiles, not the red ones, though that red cloth is very expensive and it was imported too, but other textiles that are worn are imported from all over the world, particularly India. You can see the wrapper worn by this chief is an Indian wrapper, another Indian wrapper. Some of the others are from China, from Switzerland, Austria, and so forth. And if you can find a kind of cloth that isn't common in the market, maybe you have a son, because now the ado are all over the world. Maybe you have a son in Korea that can ship something back. Someone who is in another part of the world with an unusual textile. If it fits within the parameters, you can enjoy great success at public outings like this. Architecture is still a way to distinguish oneself, not just the grooves, but other forms that perhaps are quite dashing in their presentation. These are two chiefs' homes. The one below was not finished at the time that picture was taken. And chiefs that are at this level very rarely own one home. The one at the bottom owns a home in Benin. He owns several guest houses in Benin. He owns a home in Lagos. He owns a home in London. And he owns a home in Johannesburg. And those are only the ones I happen to know about. The one at the upper right has 3 homes in Benin, 2 guest houses, and one in Lagos, one in Abuja, and one in London. So it is with this, though, that they are rivals with one another, maybe friendly at times, but not always so friendly. And it is only with their peers that they really enjoy showing these things, because then you can dig the knife of envy in and see what you can push the person to do next. Of course, then it's your turn. Sometimes the architectural exploits include things like gates. This is a fairly recent phenomenon, just really since the 90s, welded steel gates that have relief decoration. And you don't have to be a chief to own them, but chiefs generally refer to palace life one way or another through this. And you can see in the upper one, entourage again showing up with the umbrella shielding both the oba and the chief in procession with his arms supported. Below, we've got again the crossed ada and eben, and a reworking of a very famous ivory from the 16th century as the central motif of the gate. Sometimes it's carved doors, sometimes it's artworks, cement sculptures such as the one on the left, or bronze. And these chiefs often buy things from independent artists as well as the palace guilds of ivory and wood carving and of brass casting in order to decorate their homes, and vie with one another really for this. They also are great buyers of brass work from the casters, things that outsiders often say, oh, tourist art. Well, Benin doesn't have a lot of tourists. You have to have a letter of invitation to have a visa to Nigeria, so it doesn't exactly push the tourist industry forward. However, there are a lot of objects that get exported, certainly, but they are bought internally too, because the chiefs give things out as gifts. This is, again, part of the hospitality of being a known man, is to build relationships through gift giving, through favor granting. Even in the entourage, ways that you can, in procession, distinguish yourself. Rather than walking in procession, drive in your convertible. Or some of the groups that you are a patron of, if you're a patron of the Red Cross, have the Red Cross there in their uniforms and with their vehicle heading your group as they go to the palace. So these are all ways to impress others with your position, and particularly to get under the skin of your rivals. It doesn't work for everyone. As I said, everyone is not equal. Some of the chiefs are farmers or blacksmiths, leather workers, etc. But particularly in that Gaivo Nore group, there are men who represent professions of, well, with a great variety, as is not surprising. The Oba himself is a law graduate of Cambridge. And so it shouldn't be surprising. He's got some chiefs who are, let's see, we've got accountants, school teachers, retired military men. There's a professor and former vice chancellor of a university. There are also engineers, and of course businessmen of all persuasions, including one who owns a television station, an airline, a private school, a private university. So we have the whole gamut in this group, and therefore their tastes are a little different than some of the other chiefs. But if you think of the past, comparable kinds of things went on with these high-level chiefs and the way they would use art and objects and people to outstrip one another. Some of the chiefs actually do not just challenge one another, they also challenge the Oba. Not overtly, or usually not overtly. And this is again the high-ranking chiefs. That red attire that they wear with the scallops, those scallops are meant to imitate the scales of the pangolin, or scaly anteater. And the pangolin's a very peaceful animal. It only eats ants, after all. But as you can see in the lower picture, it curls up when it's threatened. And like an armadillo, that makes it impervious to any kind of harm. It's only its belly that's tender. So when it's curled up, nothing can be done to it. That is not an accidental relationship. In fact, the cloth that they are wearing, or that dress, is explicitly called pangolin skin. That's its name in Edo. Now why? There's a common proverb. If the leopard tries, well, I'm not expressing it very elegantly, but if the leopard tries to eat a pangolin, he will break his teeth. Well, okay, that may be actually biologically true, or nearly so, because it is a hard kind of a surface. But this is really a metaphor. The Oba is the leopard. And throughout many proverbs and different kinds of praise names, that relationship is made explicit. So hearing that the leopard would break his teeth is referring to the kind of power that these chiefs have attained over time, both practical power in terms of wealth and influence, and also supernatural power, that even the Oba, who is over everyone, has a tough time with these men. Now, how do they express this, or how are these tensions expressed? This is another of our plaques. You might see that the chest of this particular individual looks rather oddly swollen at the top. He represents a particular kind of courtier called an odion, and these individuals had chests that bulged because under their gown they kept a particular object. What was it? Well, this group, when the Agaivo Nore die, there are certain operations that were formerly, and whether they are still done, it's not the kind of thing one can delicately ask. I'm not an anthropologist, so I'm an art historian. But when Agaivo Nore members died in the past, their lower jaw was taken from the body. And, when it was bone alone, it was given to these men to wear under their clothing when they were in royal processions, to remind the Agaivo Nore members who were living that the part of them that argued with the Oba was now the Oba's property. So that kind of explicit relationship of rivalry and potential trouble from the people who are yet his strongest supporters, it is this kind of a dual role, was explicitly referred to in life and in art. This is a bronze staff, a rattle staff, of a type that's normally made of wood and normally placed on ancestral altars, everyone's ancestral altars. Only the Oba has certain types of imagery, and only the Oba ever has bronze or ivory examples, although most of his examples are wood too. You can see at the top is the figure of an Oba standing on top of an elephant. And this particular work has been researched by Paula Ben Amos, by Susan Vogel, and others. And it is a reference to an Oba in the 18th century whose father had been troubled by a rebellious member of that class of chiefs. And the chief had caused a civil war that continued into the son's reign. Finally, that chief, that rebel, his back was broken, so to speak, and he was represented by the elephant. So seeing the Oba here standing on the elephant is a reference to that victory, and it was a very critical victory. It's one that is referred to in other artworks. This is a Berlin altarpiece. You can see that the Oba in this work is holding that very staff. And it is the very staff because it has one elephant here and another below. You can't see the second one on this example, but it's referred to again in an artwork as an example of conquest and victory in a period where the Obas were just re-seizing power after the 17th century when it had been diminished quite a bit. That kind of history of struggles of various kinds is repeated over and over again, struggles with high-ranking chiefs, if you read recorded oral histories or listen to them. Here, one of our pieces, we have a wooden version of this same uhore, where the Oba stands atop the elephant. It is a very unusual motif, and in fact, we have not only this example, but a very rare example that shows a highly stylized elephant by itself without any figure atop. This idea of trying the Oba with art and with ceremony has not ceased. The chiefs have certain privileges. That privilege of wearing ivory bracelets vanished when elephants became less common, and the earlier ivory bracelets had escaped to museums, so to speak. But you can see in this photograph on the right, a chief in full attire, saluting with his eben, has not brass bracelets like the chief on the left, but in fact ivory ones on the right. This is not permitted inside the palace, but he's outside the palace. And this kind of thing is just what engenders a lot of gossip and discussion, and did you see kind of effect that lasts for weeks, months, and even years afterwards. I think that at least with some of these images, both past and present, you can get a bit of a feel for the kinds of tensions that can arise and the kind of tensions that can even cause someone to seek a chieftaincy in the first place. They are important parts not only of life within the palace, but in Benin generally and even in the country. As you can see, these are recent headlines from some of the respected papers in Nigeria referring to certain cases that arose in January, some of which have been settled, others of which continue. In fact, these high-level chiefs are truly celebrities and apparently always have been. And art is frequently at their service in their struggles with one another. It is also part of the record keeping of how these struggles have taken place and have been resolved one way or another. I hope you'll join us in the fall to see some of the other tensions and some of the other objects involved with them. Thank you.